Welcome. You're safe here. The world outside can wait. This is the sleep menu. It wasn't the kind of village drawn on maps. There were no roads leading in, no markets spilling into the street, no crown that claimed it. Just walls, huts, and the sound of steel echoing through the air. Smoke from low fires drifted over rooftops made of layered timber and thatch, and the pathways between buildings were worn smooth by years of boots, carts, and quiet repetition. Before we go further, if you enjoy soft-spoken tales that drift through the quiet corners of imagined worlds, make sure you're settled in. This is a slow walk through a place where life was built in the pause between battles. At the center of it all was the town hall. Not a palace, not a fortress, but the heart of everything. Wooden walls reinforced with stone, a fire always burning, a place where decisions were made and damage was counted. Maps were pinned to the walls, hand-drawn and dog-eared, with markings from past raids and guesses about what might come next. It was never empty. Someone was always planning, repairing, or remembering. The homes were small, square, neat, built close enough for shouting but not for secrets. People didn't have much, but what they had was durable. Tools sharpened to a shine, armor passed down through hands and generations. Some homes had carvings in the beams, family symbols, battle dates, names lost to time, but etched deep so they'd never fully disappear. Children grew up knowing the weight of responsibility before they knew the weight of gold. They learned to carry buckets before they carried swords. And when they weren't learning, they were watching. Warriors training, builders lifting stone, elders whispering about the last raid and the next one. Games weren't just for fun. They mimicked life. Stick fighting, obstacle courses, challenges that turned play into preparation. Every day started the same, with smoke curling from chimneys and the low beat of hammers striking iron. The blacksmiths worked before the sun finished rising, reshaping tools, mending shields, and fixing what yesterday had broken. The builders never stopped. Stones were stacked, walls reinforced, walkways patched with gravel and grit. Even in silence, the village hummed with purpose, like a forge always lit, even when no flame was visible. Food was simple. Stew thick with root vegetables, hard bread, whatever meat could be spared. Meals were eaten quickly, often standing. No one lingered long when there were walls to mend and traps to reset. But even so, mealtimes weren't without meaning. They were shared. Eyes met. Jokes passed in low voices. Small connections built in brief, quiet bites. Barbarians trained in the open yards, shirtless and sharp-eyed. Their movements were sharp, purposeful, born of endless repetition. Archers tested their aim near the eastern edge of the village, arrows thudding into painted wood targets with names scribbled in charcoal. Some shot in silence. Others shouted with each draw, trying to find a rhythm in the chaos. The air always smelled like smoke, sweat, and steel, the unmistakable perfume of a village ready for what the world might throw next. And yet, there was peace. Not in the absence of danger, but in the rhythm, in knowing what came next, in the shared work and the shared quiet, in the way people moved together without needing to speak, their actions shaped by tradition, by necessity, and by trust. When night fell, the fires glowed in neat circles. Guards took their posts, settling into the same spots they always did, eyes scanning the tree line out of habit more than fear. Others slept, swords tucked close, dreams tangled with old battles in the hope of another day. In the stillness, you could hear distant owls, the creak of wooden beams, and the soft exhale of a village wrapped in its own heartbeat. This was life in a Clash of Clans village. Not grand, not easy, but steady. Built not on riches or conquest, but on the strength of routine, the comfort of preparation, and the quiet resilience of those who call it home. Morning came with color. Pale orange threading across the sky, dew glistening on stone paths, and the low rumble of feet beginning their quiet routines. No one shouted. No one needed to. The rhythm of the village set itself. At the builder's yard, hammers struck wood in deliberate, timed beats. Each swing followed years of practice. Precise, practiced, almost like a chant. Timber was hauled in from the forest edge, each log measured and placed, destined for a new tower or to patch a damaged wall. Nothing was wasted here. Even cracked boards were sanded, shaped, used again. Children, not yet old enough for the barracks, gathered near the workshop's edge, watching with wide eyes. One tried to mimic the hammer strikes with a stick, laughing too loud, earning a gentle hush from a passing elder. Learning began by watching, by feeling the heartbeat of the village in your bones before you understood it in your head. The scent of boiled root and spiced broth crept through the center square where a cook stirred a pot near a fire pit that never quite went out. Morning stew, the kind that clung to your ribs, heavy with carrots and onion. Nearby, a few guards from the night shift leaned against a post, bowls in hand, sharing stories spoken so low you could barely catch them. About raids from seasons past, about the goblins that never returned, about scars hidden beneath armor. Barbarian recruits were already in formation behind the training shed. They moved with effort, shoulders tense, footing unsure. But they were trying, and trying was enough, for now. A seasoned warrior walked the line, correcting posture, adjusting stance, handing out words sparingly, but with weight. Not praise, not criticism, just truth. The village's rhythm didn't pause. Archers inspected their bows, checking for warp or crack. Traps were reset near the west entrance, where footprints from the last attack had only just faded. One of the healers carried a basket of herbs across the square, her fingers brushing each leaf to check for bruising. Preparation was constant. Rest was earned. By midday, the sun had climbed high enough to warm the rooftops, casting the whole village in light that made every tool glint and every blade catch a golden edge. Shadows fell long behind warriors sharpening their swords, and behind builders lifting beams into place. Even the silence here had layers. Footsteps, breathing, the soft clink of iron against stone. In a place like this, everyone had a role. Everyone belonged. Not because they were told to, because they proved it. Not with words, but with hands, sweat, and repetition. This was the village between the battles, and this was a day like any other, unremarkable to the world outside, unforgettable to the ones who lived it. Afternoons settled like a blanket, warm, weighty, and quiet. The village slowed, not from laziness, but from rhythm. Tasks continued, but voices dropped. Movements grew deliberate. Shadows stretched long across the training yard, painting lines that divided past effort from what was still to come. It was a time of stillness, not pause. Work didn't stop. It simply shifted, softened, bent around the edges of the sun. By the blacksmith's tent, heat shimmered in waves. The forge roared low, a steady breath of flame and ember. A young apprentice pumped the bellows with practiced rhythm, while an older smith inspected a cracked axe head, turning it in his hands with the care of someone holding a memory. The cracks told a story of battle, of haste, of survival. Every strike of the hammer was paced, slow enough to teach, strong enough to shape. Sparks leapt, tiny stars vanishing into the dust. Nearby, the armory remained open, racks of weapons lined up with quiet precision. Swords weren't just sharpened, they were studied, balanced. A weight in the hand meant nothing if the wielder didn't respect it. The room smelled of oil and old leather. An archer stood just outside, restringing her bow with fingers that knew tension, by feel, not by sight. Her face was calm, but her jaw was tight with focus. Each movement deliberate, patient. At the edge of the village where the walls met the tree line, sentries rotated posts. They didn't speak much. A nod was enough. Each shift a passing of trust. One leaned on his spear, eyes tracking birds overhead, while the other scanned the horizon, not for movement, but for stillness that didn't feel right. They knew the land well. A misplaced shadow, a sudden silence. Those were the signs they listened for. Their boots pressed quietly into worn paths that wrapped around the village like a second skin. The training yard had emptied for now. The recruits had been dismissed for water and quiet, but their footprints remained in the dirt, staggered, clumsy, determined. In those marks, you could read the lessons. Which one favored his left? Who forgot to pivot? Who pushed through tired legs? The dirt kept everything, at least for a while. A wooden sword leaned against a stump, forgotten for now, but not lost. The rhythm of the training echoed even after the bodies had left. In a shaded corner of the square, a healer sat cross-legged, crushing herbs with a smooth stone. Her mortar was old, carved from volcanic rock, passed down through too many hands to count. She worked, without speaking, humming something barely audible, a tune that came from memory, more than melody. The herbs released their oils, sharp and bitter, carried by the breeze. Beside her, folded cloth and clean bandages waited for evening wounds. Not far from her, 2 children rolled a wheelbarrow filled with firewood, wobbling slightly under the weight. They were too young to fight, but not too young to help. Their laughter was hushed, more breath than voice, careful not to break the peace. One of them wore a hand-me-down helmet that slipped over his eyes every few steps. He pushed it up with pride each time, and the stew pot still simmered, always simmering, someone always hungry, someone always in need of warmth. A guard passed by and ladled out a portion, muttering thanks without stopping. His armor clinked faintly as he walked. The pot was tended by an older woman who never joined the council or patrols, but who knew more about the rhythm of the village than most. She stirred with slow, steady hands, never once looking away from the fire. Overhead, birds circled. Far beyond the village walls, the world might have stirred with chaos, battles planned, raids launched, kingdoms shifted. But inside the beat went on, slow, constant, reliable. The village breathed as one, not loud, not fast, but steady. Nothing dramatic, nothing grand, just another afternoon, the kind that held the village together more than any wall ever could. The kind of moment no record would keep, but that memory would protect. 1,000 pieces of quiet, stitched into the cloth of survival. Evening arrived without fanfare. The sun dropped behind the hills in slow motion, leaving behind a sky bruised purple and streaked with gold. The air cooled with purpose. Shadows stretched until they dissolved into each other, and the day folded itself into the soft breath of night. Lanterns were lit one by one, their glow spilling across cobbled paths and packed dirt. Not bright, just enough. Flames flickered behind stained glass panels, reds, ambers, greens, casting colors on walls worn smooth by time. Each light was placed with care, the same way it had been done for generations. The villagers moved differently now. Softer, slower. Voices lowered to murmurs. Boots traded for bare feet or soft sandals. Evening was a time for returning, not rushing, for folding back into routine. Weapons were wiped clean and hung in their places. Tools returned to hooks. The village tucked itself in. At the center fire pit, a few elders sat on low stools, cloaks draped over their shoulders, cups of warm mead in hand. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Their presence alone held the space in place. A living memory of what had come before. A young warrior sat a few steps away, carving the shaft of an arrow. His blade moved with quiet purpose, stripping away slivers of wood. He wasn't in a hurry. No battle waited. But still, he worked. Because something inside him said he should. On the far side of the village near the animal pens, a mother hushed a baby with slow circles and gentle humming. The melody wasn't a lullaby. Not really. Just a tune passed down from someone who needed peace and found it in sound. It wasn't about lyrics. It was about rhythm. Dinner was light. Bread baked in the embers, soft cheese, pickled roots, dried meats torn into strips. People sat where they could. Steps, benches, flat stones near the well. There was talking, but not too much. The kind of talking that filled space without demanding it. Laughter was quiet and brief, like a match struck and blown out before it could burn. As darkness deepened, the guard shifts rotated again. A fresh pair walked the wall, lanterns swaying in their hands. They checked the gates. They checked the sky. One reached down and touched the earth, as if listening to it speak. The other watched the tree line, counting the heartbeats between bird calls. Children were called inside. Doors were closed. Not locked, just latched. The kind of gesture that said, "We trust the night, but still we watch." And slowly, the village disappeared into itself, light by light, voice by voice, until only the stars remained, above roofs, above fields, above sleeping minds that had earned their rest. This was the quiet after the work, the silence not of fear but of fullness, the kind of peace only found in places where everyone knows their part and plays it well. Morning returned without asking. It slipped in through the cracks between rooftops and slid across the dew-covered grass. It touched every surface. Warming blades of grass, fog-wrapped stones, the curve of wooden doors still closed tight against the chill. The village didn't wake all at once. It unfolded. One yawn, one bootlace, one quiet stretch at a time. The light was slow and golden, like it had nowhere better to be. The first to rise were always the same. The builders, stirring in their sleep before even realizing they'd moved. They stepped out with hammers slung across shoulders and calloused fingers already flexing in anticipation. Their boots were caked with old dust, but they didn't bother cleaning them. They weren't trying to impress anyone. They didn't speak much. Their language was structure. Their prayer was preparation. One checked a wall near the east gate, gently tapping a timber beam to see how it responded. Another smoothed wet mortar between stones, humming a wordless tune no one else knew. The cook fires followed. Thin smoke curled up from clay ovens and open pits. The scent of baking bread drifted low and slow, the kind of smell that found its way through shutters and reminded even the most tired bones that a new day had begun. A child cracked open a door and blinked into the light, hair tangled, holding a wooden bowl like it was treasure. Inside the mess hut, a woman rolled dough between her palms, then slapped it onto a hot, flat stone. Sizzle. Steam. The rhythm of a morning that had happened 100 times before and would happen 100 more. Tools clinked softly as the blacksmith's tent opened. Not all the way, just enough for the sound of the forge to breathe. The coals glowed, not hot yet, but hopeful. A new blade rested on a bench nearby, unfinished. Its edge had been shaped, but not sharpened. The smith ran a thumb across it, not to test, but to remember where he'd left off. Sparks from yesterday's grind still clung to the corners. He turned the blade in the light and nodded once, almost to himself, before slipping into his apron and feeding the fire back to life. Across the main path, 2 warriors circled each other slowly in the training yard. Neither attacked. They moved like they were part of a slow dance, one that taught patience before speed. Their feet kicked up light dust, drawing loose shapes across the yard. A third leaned against the fence, arms crossed, watching, not judging, just learning. Every motion was a lesson. Every breath carried weight. In the gardens, older villagers knelt beside rows of herbs and root vegetables. Their movements were low and steady, their hands covered in earth. One woman whispered something to the soil as she dug. A habit. A thank you. Maybe both. Another man worked silently beside her, arranging stones around a new planting bed, eyes squinting in the sun. Bees buzzed lazily over flowering vines, and a pair of birds hopped from row to row, pecking at whatever insects dared surface. Birds called from the treetops, shaking off the night. Chickens pecked at the dirt near the coop, already arguing over the same scraps. A goat kicked a bucket, startling a sleepy stable hand who muttered something about needing another hour. The goat didn't care. It nuzzled a bale of hay with disinterest before wandering off to the water trough. At the well, a group gathered with buckets, exchanging nods and news in equal measure. They spoke in fragments: weather, patrols, who'd fixed what. The kind of conversation that didn't require attention, just presence. A few shared bread, still warm. One poured a splash of water over his head and sighed. Another used the side of the well as a seat, running his fingers along an old carving etched deep into the stone. Names, marks of those who'd drawn from the well long before any of them. And so, the village moved. Not all at once, not loudly, but with a kind of practiced grace. Every step taken was one that had been taken before, and would be taken again tomorrow. No rush. No panic. Just life, rebuilt each morning, one breath at a time. Chickens clucked, doors creaked, blades sharpened. Nothing dramatic, just steady motion. This was how the day began, not with horns, not with fire, but with habit, with hands in the soil, with steam in the air, with people who knew what needed doing and simply did it. Not for glory, just because they were part of something bigger, a system, a rhythm, a village that held itself together through repetition. Because the village was more than walls. It was motion. It was memory. It was effort passed down like stories, and names whispered in the quiet corners of dawn. And in the quiet persistence of its people, it became strong. Not because it was unbreakable, but because it never stopped moving forward, one small act at a time. Afternoon brought its own kind of silence. Not empty, just slower, more thoughtful. The kind of silence filled with soft clinks of tools, distant footsteps, and the whisper of wind weaving between rooftops. In the center of the village, the training yard was quiet again, but not abandoned. A single archer stood at the far edge, adjusting her stance. She wasn't aiming for speed or power, just repetition. Draw, aim, release, over and over. Each arrow found the target with a dull thud. Not perfect, but consistent. Her breath matched her rhythm, controlled, focused, like everything else here. Elsewhere, a carpenter stood beneath an open awning, fitting new hinges onto a door frame. The wood was dark and worn, reused from another structure. Nothing went to waste here. His saw moved slow, teeth biting with patience. He didn't hum or speak. The work didn't need sound, just care. In the mess hut, lunch had come and gone. Now a few elders sat beneath the awning, sipping from wooden bowls, murmuring stories in half sentences. One chuckled softly. Another shook his head, eyes closed, remembering. The cook cleaned nearby, wiping the long table with a damp cloth. Her movements were slow but deliberate, the kind of speed that comes from doing the same thing every day and still doing it well. By the stables, the animals stirred again. A horse snorted softly and pawed the ground. A stable hand, no older than 15, brushed its flank with long, steady strokes. He whispered as he worked, not to the horse, but to himself. Practicing words, maybe, or just filling the silence with something familiar. The village walls stood steady, watched by a pair of guards making their third round of the day. One pointed out a weak plank near the southern edge. The other made a note with charcoal on a scrap of hide. They didn't need to argue. Fixing it was obvious. They just moved on. boots crunching softly against packed dirt. Children played quietly near the well, not loud games, but ones that fit the hour, stacking pebbles, racing leaf boats in a shallow stream, drawing figures in the dust. Their laughter came in short bursts, like birdsong, light, brief, and gone before it lingered too long. The sun hung lower now, painting long shadows across the rooftops and soaking the village in gold. A gentle wind picked up, sending ripples through the banners and cooling the air just enough to make everyone breathe easier. It was the kind of moment that didn't need to be marked, but still mattered. No one declared the day a success. No one cheered, but the village moved on, step by step, task by task. No fanfare, just the kind of work that makes a place whole. The sky began to shift. Late afternoon leaned into early evening, and with it came a change in the air, cooler, slower, touched by a softness that only the end of the day brings. The sounds of hammers and tools had thinned. Conversations were fewer. Most of the village slipped into smaller, quieter tasks, like the village itself was taking a long breath before dusk. The dust from earlier had settled, and everything seemed to settle with it. At the river's edge, a woman knelt, scrubbing worn linen against a flat stone. The water lapped rhythmically, carrying suds downstream in lazy spirals. She didn't rush. There was no reason to. She'd washed clothes in this spot for years, watched the seasons change in the shape of the current. The stone had worn smooth from her hands and others like hers before. She paused now and then, lifting her head to feel the breeze on her face, her fingers trailing idly through the cool water. Around her, frogs chirped in the reeds, and birds settled into low branches. Closer to the center, the town hall door creaked open, and a figure stepped out. One of the builders, older, slower now, his back slightly bent from years of lifting and hauling. He leaned on a walking stick carved with small notches, one for every wall he'd helped raise. He paused on the steps, looking out over the village like someone counting not buildings, but memories. He squinted against the golden light, spotting repairs that could wait and others that couldn't, already making a mental note for morning. Smoke rose from scattered cook fires. The scent of onions and broth drifted between homes, blending with the smell of dry grass and warm wood. Some stirred pots with long-handled spoons, humming softly to themselves. Others laid out cloth across low tables, setting out bowls and mugs passed from hand to hand over many years. A boy ran past with a bundle of sticks under his arm, trying not to spill them. A girl followed with a ladle twice the size of her hand, determined not to drop it. These were the last flurries of motion before nightfall, a quiet urgency in every step. On the eastern edge were leaning, where the land dipped slightly toward the woods. An elder sat with two children at his feet. He drew shapes in the dirt with a stick, telling them stories of dragons that once flew overhead and giants who carved the mountains with their bare hands. The children didn't ask if it was true. They didn't need to. The way he spoke made it feel like it could have been. His voice drifted slowly, matching the lengthening shadows. Inside the healer's hut, lamps were being lit. Not bright, just enough to soften the room. The glow spilled onto the path like warm honey. Shelves of herbs and folded cloth lined the walls, carefully arranged. Jars clinked as they were opened and closed. A few bruised or scraped villagers sat quietly waiting their turn. No groaning, no drama, just patience. Pain here was something handled with calm. The healer moved steadily, her hands sure, her words few but kind. At the far edge of the camp, beyond the last post and under the wide oak tree, a lone warrior practiced footwork. No sword, just stance, balance, shifting weight from heel to toe, turning slowly, silently, training that was more about thought than force. The grass beneath him had long since worn thin, and his breaths moved in time with the fading breeze. He wasn't preparing for a fight. He was remembering how to move like water. The light dimmed, slowly but surely. The village didn't fight it. Lamps were lit, shutters closed gently, animals herded into pens. Chickens rustled into nests, and a pair of goats settled side by side in the straw. Night was coming. But it didn't bring fear, just another shape of the day. Another rhythm to follow. The village eased into evening like it had 100 times before. And as the first star blinked into view above the horizon, the village exhaled together. One long, steady breath. Preparing for evening, not with noise, but with peace. A silence born not from emptiness, but from fullness. The quiet of something well-lived, well-worn, and well understood. Evening had fully arrived. The sky was deepening into a muted blue, and a silver thread of moonlight began to tease its way across the rooftops. The day's light gave way to something quieter, a hush that settled over the village, not like an ending, but like an exhale. The kind of peace that's earned, the kind you don't question, you just accept. The village was no longer working, not in the way it had been all day, but it was still alive. Different rhythms took over now. Softer, slower, more reflective. Movements became fluid, drawn out. Voices lowered out of instinct rather than instruction. It was a shift everyone felt, even if no one mentioned it. Evening didn't ask permission. It simply arrived and was welcomed. The fires that had started as cooking flames were now gathering points. Small groups formed naturally, leaning in to share warmth and presence. Conversations drifted like smoke. Soft, unfinished, never in a hurry. Some shared stories, snippets of the day, laughter muffled by the flicker of flame. Others simply sat in the glow, their silence not awkward, but comfortable. A warrior crouched at the edge, sharpening a blade with long, steady strokes. Not for battle, not for display, just because that's what was done. Each pull of the stone left a whisper in the air, a rhythm more meditative than mechanical. At the well, a woman drew her final bucket for the day. The rope creaked in a familiar way. The bucket thudded softly against the stone lip. She paused afterward, hands still on the rope, and looked upward. The stars were just beginning to appear. Not in clusters, not all at once, but slowly, as if testing the sky. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. There was nothing to ask for, nothing to explain. The sky had its answers, whether she voiced her questions or not. Near the central square, a father swept the dirt outside his doorway, not to clean, but to smooth. His broom made wide arcs across the packed earth, evening out the ground for tomorrow. His child sat nearby, knees tucked to chest, drawing slow shapes into the dust with a stick. Not pictures, not words, just marks, like they were writing a language only they understood. The father didn't interrupt. He just kept sweeping. The healer had closed her hut. The lamp inside had been snuffed, its wick trimmed and left to cool. Her tools were cleaned and stacked, linens folded, the scent of dried herbs still lingering in the doorway. The door was left open, not for visitors, but for air. The cool night breeze helped wash away the day. No one knocked, not because they had forgotten her, but because tonight, for once, no one was bleeding, coughing, or feverish. Peace isn't just the absence of noise. Sometimes it's the absence of need. A few guards began their rounds, pacing the perimeter with slow, practiced steps. Their armor creaked with the familiarity of use, their torches casting long shadows along the wooden walls. They didn't speak often, but when they did, it was brief. A note about a shifted plank, a reminder to check the south post. Their job wasn't to stop danger. It was to see it coming. And for now, there was nothing to see. In a clearing beyond the livestock pens, a young recruit practiced alone. The rest had long since returned to their beds, but he stayed. His form was raw, his footing a little too heavy, his swings too fast, but he was trying. Each mistake brought a pause, a breath, a correction. Not out of frustration, but out of commitment. He didn't need a crowd. He didn't need applause. Just space and time. The village had quieted, but it hadn't shut down. It breathed differently now. Slower. With intention. No one rang a bell to mark the change, but everyone felt it. It was in the way footsteps softened, in the way voices lowered, in the way even the wind seemed to move more gently between buildings. A breeze wandered through the village carrying the scent of ash, earth, and cooked root vegetables. Curtains fluttered. A door creaked. Somewhere, a loose sign tapped against a post, over and over, like the heartbeat of the place. But no one rushed to fix it. The sound belonged. It had its place. And above it all, the stars continued their quiet march across the sky, unnoticed by most, but not unappreciated. They didn't need attention to matter. They simply shone. Even in sleep, the village moved in time with them. Slow, constant, and whole. Everything just was. And that was enough. Morning in the village began with soft light stretching over the eastern wall. Not sudden, not sharp, just a slow wash of warmth that crept along rooftops and settled gently on stone. The shadows of the night lingered briefly in corners, but even they seemed to know it was time to fade. The first sounds were familiar. The low creak of a wooden door, the scrape of boots over packed dirt, a cough, a yawn, the shuffle of a blanket being folded. The village didn't explode into action. It unfurled, like a stretch after sleep. Steady, quiet, full of intention. In the center square, the hearth fires were already flickering to life. A builder stoked the flames with practiced hands, adding small branches, then logs, coaxing heat without words. Nearby, a kettle hung over a second fire, steam rising in a lazy spiral into the morning air. It smelled faintly of root tea, sharp, earthy, grounding. A few steps away, the blacksmith opened the flap of his forge tent, stepping into the day with sleeves already rolled. He didn't speak, didn't look around, just reached for his tools, checked their weight in his hands, and began to arrange them one by one. Each clang of metal was deliberate, not disruptive, the kind of sound that fit perfectly into the morning's rhythm. A pair of children chased each other past the well, their laughter light and breathless. Their game had no rules, no name, but their feet knew where to land, how to avoid the chickens, how not to disturb the pile of bricks someone had stacked for a new wall. Their mother called after them once, but not loudly. She knew they'd loop back eventually. The healer, rested and alert, stepped from her doorway with a bundle of dried herbs under one arm. She paused, closed her eyes, and breathed deeply. The scent of morning was different from evening, cleaner, cooler, less tangled with fire and sweat. She crossed the square slowly, nodding to the cook, who had just begun slicing root vegetables for the mid-morning stew. Barbarians trained in the eastern yard, their bodies already slick with early sweat. They didn't shout or compete, just repetition, movement, practice. A sword swung low, then high, a pause, a correction, again. Their grunts and footfalls were the day's first rhythm, steady as breath. By the livestock pens, a stable hand carried feed to the pigs, whistling under his breath. A chicken darted between his legs. He didn't break stride. A dog barked once and went quiet. It was a morning like many before it, not special, not eventful, but complete. The village didn't need something extraordinary to be alive. It just needed people who showed up, who did their work, who knew the rhythm, who understood that peace wasn't the absence of activity. It was the presence of purpose, and in every corner, every task, every breath, that purpose moved, slowly, steadily, as sure as the sun climbing higher in the sky. Midday carried a quiet hum, not silence, not noise, something in between, the kind of sound made by many hands working in sync, not needing words to keep the beat. In the training yard, drills shifted from movement to maintenance. Barbarians wiped down weapons, checked grips, and tightened leather bindings with fingers still buzzing from the morning's repetition. One of them whittled a broken arrow shaft into something new, a handle for a cooking knife, maybe. Nothing wasted. Near the well, a group gathered for water. There was no line, no rush, just a rhythm. Draw, pour, pass. The buckets moved hand to hand, and even the splashes on the stone felt familiar. A young girl leaned over to catch her reflection, then traced a ripple across the surface with one fingertip. A moment later, she was gone, chasing her brother between tents. The cook's fire burned steady. The scent of stew had deepened, richer now, thicker with herbs. She stirred it with a long-handled ladle, pausing only to add a pinch of salt from a cloth pouch tied to her belt. A boy brought her more firewood without being asked. He dropped it beside her, got a nod in return, and left without a word. At the edge of the village, 2 builders worked on reinforcing a wall beam. One stood on a ladder hammering a wedge into place. The other braced the post with his shoulder, boots dug deep into the dirt. Their conversation was low and sparse, just enough to sync their movements. They'd done this before. They'd do it again. A merchant cart rolled into the village slowly, its wheels creaking under the weight of bundled cloth and iron tools. The driver was known. His arrival met with quiet waves and half smiles. No shouting, no deals shouted through the square. Just a steady pull toward the shade of an old awning, where he began unpacking in neat rows. In a shaded corner, the healer laid herbs out on a flat stone to dry. Leaves spread like pages in a book, turning slightly in the breeze. She ran her fingers over each one with care, checking for bruises, tearing away the stems. Time moved slower in her space, or maybe just deeper. Somewhere in the trees, a bird called out. Not alarmed, just present. The kind of sound you only notice when everything else is steady. The sun hung directly overhead now, casting short shadows and warming the backs of those still working. No one spoke of the time. They felt it in their bones, in the air, in the shifting pace of footsteps. This was midday. Not a pause, not a peak. Just part of the rhythm, as necessary as breath, as natural as the path worn smooth beneath the blacksmith's boots. The village moved, always. Not fast, not loud, just enough. The afternoon came with longer shadows and slower steps. The sun had passed its peak, but its warmth still clung to the ground, rising off the stone paths in gentle waves. No one rushed. The village didn't rush. It flowed, steady, measured, grounded. Time didn't press here. It stretched. Near the center square, a young girl helped fold cloth, blankets, wraps, worn tunics, each one smoothed out carefully before being stacked. Her mother worked beside her, saying little, showing her what mattered by how she moved. Edges aligned, corners pressed flat. It wasn't about the cloth. It was about the care. The girl didn't ask why they folded the same way every time. She watched, mirrored, learned. Other families walked by, nodding politely. One older woman paused to adjust the drying line, re-pinning a flapping towel that had come loose in the breeze. A boy carrying a wooden bucket stopped to watch the cloth folding for a moment, curiosity in his eyes before he continued on his way. Behind the cook's tent, an older man was sharpening blades, not for battle, just kitchen knives and tools dulled from daily use. He sat on a low stool, whetstone in hand, pulling each blade along its surface with quiet, steady precision. Each pass made a sound like a whisper, familiar and soft. He paused every few strokes to inspect the edge, squinting against the sun. A second stool sat empty beside him, a space open for anyone who might want to learn. By the livestock pens, a group of children sat in a circle. One was telling a story with her hands, shaping the air into dragons and soldiers. The others leaned in, wide-eyed, even though they had heard the tale before. some stories were worth hearing more than once. One boy mimed the hero's sword swing at just the right moment, drawing giggles from the others. A pair of archers walked the outer path, not on patrol, just stretching their legs. One pointed to the treetops, counting birds. The other listened, nodding, occasionally smiling. Their bows remained slung across their backs, more comfort than precaution. As they passed the orchard, they stopped to inspect a few apples beginning to ripen, their skins flushed with color, still weeks from harvest. In the field beyond the wall, two farmers checked on a small patch of vegetables. Most food came from the trade or hunting, but a few things could grow here. Roots, herbs, bitter greens. They knelt in the dirt, clearing weeds with practiced hands, not rushing, not speaking. The plants didn't need noise, just attention. They worked in tandem, pulling weeds, checking leaves for damage, adjusting the stones that lined the irrigation trench. At the well, the water buckets were full. Someone had taken the time to refill them. No one knew who. No one needed to. It was just what was done. A young apprentice filled a jug and carefully balanced it as he walked it back to the training yard, lips pressed in concentration. A few others nodded as he passed. Not praise, just acknowledgement. The builder's ladder still leaned against the wall beam, but the workers had moved on. Their tools were packed, their footprints left behind in the dust. The wood they placed held firm. It didn't creak. A hammer lay forgotten on a barrel, soon to be collected. From above, the roof glinted slightly, a new plank still drying in the sun. Even the dogs moved slower now, stretched out in patches of shade, their ears twitching but their bodies still. A cat balanced along the low stone wall, tail swaying, eyes half-lidded. A pair of pigeons bobbed across the square, unbothered by the quiet movement of people around them. And above it all, the village breathed. It didn't wait for anything. It didn't need a reason to keep moving. It simply did, with hands that knew the work, with feet that knew the path, with people who understood that every quiet task was part of something lasting. And so, the afternoon unfolded, not urgent, not idle, just alive, with the kind of life that grows slowly, deliberately, through the cracks in time. The heat had begun to drift, but the air still held warmth like a fading memory. In the hour just before evening, the village leaned into stillness. Not sleep, not yet, but something near it. A hush filled not with silence, but with softer sounds. Footsteps over dry ground, the brush of cloth, the occasional low laugh carried on the breeze. Even the birds overhead seemed to fly slower, circling wide in the amber light. In the weaving tent, two sisters sat back to back, their looms propped across their laps. Threads moved between fingers, pulling colors through patterns older than either of them. They didn't speak much. The older one worked with speed, the younger with care. Between them, the cloth grew. A blanket, maybe, or something ceremonial. It didn't matter. The pattern mattered. The repetition, the quiet discipline of it. A bowl of dye sat nearby, still warm from the morning sun, waiting for the final threads to dry before the next layer of color could be applied. A few paces away, the healer checked her baskets. Bundles of crushed herbs, wrapped tight in wax cloth, sorted by scent and strength. She sniffed one, nodded to herself, and tucked it back beneath the awning. Nothing was rushed. She was measuring time, by sun angle, by scent, by muscle memory, not by the hour. She paused to write something in a leather-bound ledger, its pages stained and curling, each entry a quiet piece of knowledge passed down by hands older than hers. Down the main path, a boy repaired a cracked water jug using strips of cloth and clay. He didn't ask for help, didn't expect it. He simply worked, tongue pressed to his lip in focus, hands steady despite his age. A man passed, looked once, said nothing, but his nod lingered long enough to be felt. The boy didn't smile, but he sat straighter, hands moving just a little more carefully. Near the animal pens, a girl brushed down one of the older oxen. Its eyes were half closed, tail flicking at flies. The girl hummed as she worked, a tune without words, one she probably made up on the spot. Her fingers moved with care, not speed. The ox didn't flinch when she shifted sides. A cat curled in the straw nearby, flicking its ears lazily, as if it too was part of the routine. In a quiet corner near the grain storage, two elders played a game with smooth stones. One moved quickly, always thinking ahead. The other moved slow, with a soft smile that suggested winning wasn't the point. They said little, but their silences were full, a life's worth of shared pauses between them. Now and then, one would chuckle or raise an eyebrow, not at the game, but at a memory that surfaced with the gesture. From the northern wall, someone called out. Not alarm, just a report. A merchant cart had appeared in the distance, still a while from arriving. A runner was sent to inform the head of trade. No rush, no concern, just protocol. The cart would arrive when it arrived. Behind the gate, a few villagers began stacking empty crates, counting them off in low tones as the sun continued to drift downward. Under a fig tree by the east wall, a woman sat weaving a fishing net. Her hands moved in loops and knots, the mesh growing slowly between her knees. A child sat beside her, not helping, just watching. His eyes followed every move, his breath shallow with focus, as if watching long enough might teach his hands the same rhythm. Occasionally, he reached out to mimic a knot in the dust, his fingers tracing loops that would vanish with the next breeze. Further out, past the main gate, two guards leaned on their spears and talked. Not about enemies, not about plans. Just about the shape of clouds, the taste of the stew, the last time either of them saw rain. Their voices didn't carry. They didn't need to. One of them tapped the shaft of his spear in rhythm with his words, the soft clicks, marking a kind of invisible metronome for the end of the day. And across all of it, the sun dipped lower. Its light softened the world into gold. The shadows stretched, and the sky took on that particular still blue of a day, not yet over. The light touched every corner. The drying clay, the half-woven cloth, the game board, the gate, the children, the guards. It didn't ask for attention. It just arrived. No one called it evening. Not yet. But everyone knew it was near. A few fires were lit. A few hands reached for cloaks. Nothing urgent, just part of the rhythm. And still, the village moved. Not forward, not fast, just with time, with each other, with care, with the kind of quiet that holds everything together, without asking to be noticed. The sky had turned the color of cooled embers, and with it came a deeper stillness. Evening was near, not in name, but in the way people moved slower, how conversation slipped into softer tones, and how tools were laid down rather than dropped. It was a kind of quiet earned, not given, the kind that settled into the corners of a place and made itself known, not by silence, but by absence. The absence of urgency, of noise, of unfinished work. Near the village's edge, just beside the storage hut, a young woman swept dust into a wide wooden pan. The broom was worn, its bristles uneven from years of use, but her motion was smooth and steady. She didn't sweep with force. She guided the dust, coaxed it forward, letting the day's grit follow her lead. With every stroke, the path beneath her feet reappeared as if drawn back into being. Her face was blank, not from boredom, but from the kind of quiet focus that settles deep in the bones after a long day. She paused only once to tuck a stray braid behind her ear, then returned to her rhythm without a word, each pass of the broom its own small ritual. In the shade of a long cloth canopy, 3 men repaired a section of netting used for hauling grain. Their fingers worked quickly but without rush, each knot tied from memory. Not just repetition, but remembrance. Their hands were lined with calluses and old scars, but they moved with precision. One of them cracked a joke, something dry, something old. And the others responded with brief smirks. Not laughter, just recognition. They'd all heard it before and would again. The joke was a formality, not for humor, but for rhythm, part of the way the village breathed. Near the well, a young boy carried a bucket, half his size. He grunted as he walked, careful not to spill, his arms stiff with concentration. He passed a group of elders seated on a bench carved long ago, their faces mapped with years and sun. Their eyes tracked him with the same quiet pride that never needed to be said aloud. One of them called out a suggestion, not quite advice, more like tradition disguised as guidance. The boy didn't answer, but adjusted his grip as if to say, "I heard you." By a small patch of herbs, two girls watered the plants in silence, taking turns with a hollowed-out gourd. The soil drank eagerly, darkening as it soaked. A small lizard darted out from between the rows, startling them both. One laughed, a light sound that vanished into the wind. The other only watched it vanish again, her expression unreadable. They moved slowly, carefully, respecting the roots as if they were something sacred. At the central courtyard, the cook stirred a fresh pot over a low flame. The scent was rich, something with lentils, maybe dried fig, maybe ground nuts. She added spices with pinched fingers, not measuring, just knowing. Her movements were confident, unhurried. A younger woman stood beside her, watching every motion with silent attention. She asked no questions, and the cook offered no commentary. Teaching happened whether words were used or not. Between them, a legacy passed quietly through the steam. Further out, behind the main structure, a man sat alone, mending a sandal by firelight. His hands worked carefully along the cracked strap. Leather and twine. Slow progress. He wasn't in a hurry to finish. The sandal would hold. It just had to be seen. His breath moved with the wind, syncing with the faint rustle of dry grass nearby. His eyes occasionally lifted to the horizon, not searching, just watching. The guards atop the wall were shadows now, their silhouettes framed by the darkening sky. They didn't pace, they watched. One leaned against the wood, eyes fixed on the horizon. The other picked at something between his teeth, then turned his gaze skyward. Stars were beginning to show, one by one, like quiet promises. They stood in practiced stillness, not tense, but ready. The kind of readiness that comes from living through many quiet nights and a few loud ones. Inside the walls, the last chores wrapped themselves up. Grain sacks were stacked. Chickens were herded into coops with soft clucks and fluttering wings. A child, half asleep, was carried across the square in his mother's arms, one hand dangling, fingers twitching as if still playing in his dreams. A dog padded after them, tail wagging low, steps muffled by the dust. No one declared the day over, but everyone knew. A few final words were exchanged, a few tools set aside for morning, fires tucked into stones, blankets unfurled and placed with care. Eyes lifted to the sky, not searching for signs, just acknowledging the shift. The village moved again, not in action, not even in thought. It moved in settling, in rest, in the slow exhale of a place that had done enough for one day. And in that exhale, there was peace. Not because all was perfect, but because everything that could be done was done. And that was enough. The fire was burning low. A slow, steady glow pulsed from the coals, not for warmth, not for cooking, but for presence. It wasn't the kind of fire that called attention to itself. It didn't crackle with drama or flare up to prove something. It simply stayed, humming gently, the way a heartbeat might if it lived in the ground. A girl sat close to it, her knees pulled to her chest, chin resting on folded arms. She wasn't cold. She wasn't tired. She was waiting. Not for someone, but for a feeling. one that came sometimes when the night got this quiet and the stars lined up just right. The feeling of being small, but safe, of being one part of something bigger, older, already in motion. She watched the embers shift and pulse, orange giving way to soft red, red giving way to black. Nearby, someone added another log. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. The fire accepted it with a soft sigh of sparks, and the glow grew stronger, casting shadows that moved like slow dancers across the ground. The light reached out toward bare feet and calloused hands, touching the edges of worn cloaks and dust-lined cheeks. No one flinched. It was the kind of warmth that made you stay still. A few others had gathered by then. One man leaned back against a large, woven basket, arms behind his head, staring up through the trees. His breath moved slow, rising in soft clouds that caught the firelight before vanishing. Two sisters passed a shared cup of warm water, their hands brushing but their eyes focused on the flame. Even the dog had come, curling up just outside the circle of light, nose tucked under paw. It twitched once, maybe dreaming. No stories were told, no arguments, no plans. But in the silence, something was happening. Something real. Something quiet that reached past sound and settled somewhere deeper. A kind of understanding that needed no words. The kind of moment where no one wanted to leave, and no one had to explain why. It was the kind of moment that stitched people together. Not loud, not bold, just lasting. A shared breath, a shared stillness. You couldn't plan for it. You couldn't make it happen. It simply appeared, and everyone recognized it. One girl broke off a piece of bread and placed it near the fire, not as an offering, not quite, but as habit. Something she'd seen her grandmother do when she was small. Her fingers hovered just a second longer than needed, as if waiting for something. A nod, a sign, a thank you from the flames. But the fire didn't change. It just burned on, quiet and sure. No one commented. No one questioned. It stayed there, untouched. Above them, the sky opened wider. More stars now. Closer, it seemed, than before, as if leaning in to listen. The kind of stars that made you forget to blink. A slow breeze carried the scent of ash and pine. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called once and then went quiet. Someone coughed. Someone shifted. The fire popped, but no one left. Because there was nothing to go to. No urgent matter to attend. No voice pulling them away. And nowhere more important than right here, where the light was low, and the night was soft, and the only thing anyone had to do was nothing at all. And that, in itself, was everything. The day was winding down, not with noise or speed, but with a hush that fell slowly over the village like a warm cloth, the kind of hush that told you it was time to finish what you were doing, time to let the tools rest where they were, time to exhale without realizing you'd been holding your breath. Even the animals seemed to understand. Their movements slowed, their sounds softened, as though they too were ready to hand the day back to the night. The sky turned a deeper kind of blue, one that slowly bled into indigo as the first stars prepared their quiet entrance. It was the sort of sky that made the torches flicker brighter by contrast, the kind of light that settled more than it shined. Villagers moved slower now, their steps softer, conversations shorter, more thoughtful. They didn't need to say much. Everyone knew the rhythm by now. There was a time for speaking, and there was a time to simply be. Near the central well, a group of workers leaned against the stone ledge, not drawing water, just feeling the coolness of it on their fingertips. Their hands bore the dust and scratches of the day, but their faces were calm. A few nodded in greeting as others passed. One woman offered a small smile, tired but real. That was enough. That was all it needed to be. A boy chased the last light of the sun as it slid behind the rooftops. He ran with a wooden sword, swinging at shadows that danced away just before he reached them. His laughter was quiet, more breath than sound, and it lingered like smoke before fading. A father watched from the doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing, just watching, just remembering how it once felt to move without thought. At the edge of the village, someone strung up fresh herbs to dry, lavender, sage, and something bitter whose name had been forgotten, but whose use hadn't. The scent drifted on the breeze, weaving between the huts like a soft reminder that tomorrow would come, and it would be much the same. And that was comfort. Predictability wasn't dull. It was safe, reliable, like the heartbeat of the earth beneath their feet. The forge had long cooled, the last embers hidden beneath ash, waiting to be stirred again tomorrow. The blacksmith had wiped down his tools, his hands still stained but steady. The anvil, now silent, held a small cloth bundle atop it, a broken blade to be mended in the morning. Guards made their final sweep. They didn't expect trouble, but they walked the perimeter just the same. Their eyes moved with care, not worry. One tapped the gate with the back of his hand before turning in. A habit, a small way to mark the day, complete. Another paused to tie a loose strap on the fencing. Nothing urgent, just something noticed and handled. A family sat just outside their home, their meal finished, bowls wiped clean, stacked neatly for washing in the morning. No one spoke. One of them hummed. Another leaned back and stared up at the sky, tracing imaginary shapes between the stars not yet fully visible. The fire crackled in front of them, low and steady, casting shadows that swayed like dancers in slow motion. In another corner of the village, a woman sat alone, mending a tear in a cloak by torchlight. Her needle moved with patient hands. Each stitch pulled the fabric back into wholeness. She wasn't rushing. She had no need to. The night was long and kind, and in that moment, the whole village felt like it was breathing together. Long, slow breaths. In, outside, like the air itself was resting, like time had loosened its grip. Nothing extraordinary, nothing new, just a shared stillness, and the deep, quiet strength that came with it. The kind of strength that didn't shout, it simply stayed, and that was enough. The night had settled fully now, not with finality but with calm, a kind of presence that wrapped around the village like an old, familiar blanket. Everything had softened. The lines, the sounds, even the thoughts moving through people's minds. It was the kind of night that didn't just quiet a place, it soothed it, as if the entire village was exhaling, together. Torches flickered low along the paths, casting more glow than light, just enough to guide the way without disturbing the dark. The flames danced gently, swaying in rhythm with the soft night breeze. You could hear the wind now, more clearly than before. It carried the scent of earth, ash, and the faint trace of stew that still lingered in the air. Occasionally, a wooden shutter creaked as it settled into place. Somewhere, a dog barked once, then remembered it wasn't the time for that, and went quiet again. In the trees beyond the walls, an owl called out softly and was answered from farther away. A few doors stayed open a little longer, not out of carelessness, but comfort. A way of saying, we're still here. Not all the way asleep, not all the way awake. Somewhere in between, like the village itself. Light spilled onto the ground in warm rectangles. Inside, flickers of movement, someone folding a blanket, another tucking tools into a chest, a third simply sitting still, watching the shadows stretch and breathe. Inside one home, an elder told a story in a low voice, just above a whisper. Two children leaned against her sides, heads heavy, eyes half closed. The story didn't have an ending. It didn't need one. The words were soft, almost circular, looping gently through old names and half-true memories. She paused often, not for effect, but because the pauses felt like part of the story too. It was the rhythm, not the plot, that mattered. The kind of rhythm that helped little hearts slow down and drift. By the well, someone had forgotten a bucket. It tilted slightly on the stones, catching the torchlight in its metal band. No one rushed to move it. It would be there in the morning, like everything else. A cat padded by, tail flicking, eyes reflecting the faint light before slipping into the dark again. The bucket rocked once, then settled. Farther out, near the tree line, 2 guards walked their final stretch. They spoke quietly, not out of secrecy, but respect. The forest didn't stir, no threat, just the stillness of leaves resting against one another. The moon hung low, casting soft silver light on their path. One of the guards paused to adjust a loose strap on his armor, then continued without a word. Their steps matched, practiced. They didn't need to look at each other to move in sync. Near the stables, a boy whispered to one of the horses. He wasn't feeding it or grooming it. Just there. Just present. The horse blinked slowly, shifting its weight. They both understood something that didn't need to be said. The boy leaned against the wooden post, silent, while the horse exhaled deeply, its breath visible in the cool night air. At the fire pit in the village center, embers pulsed like a quiet heartbeat. No one added wood. It wasn't meant to last the night. Just long enough. A few villagers sat nearby, cloaks pulled around their shoulders, faces lit in flickers. They didn't speak. They just watched. The flames, the stars, each other. Someone stirred the coals once, not to wake them, just to hear the sound. It was a comfort. Overhead, the stars shone sharp and steady, the kind of stars that looked like they belonged to the village. Constant companions rather than distant mysteries. A few heads tilted back to take them in. No wishes, no counting, just presence. There was no signal, no cue, but slowly, door by door, torch by torch, the village dimmed. It wasn't a retreat, it was a surrender, a trust, that the night would hold until morning. And it would. It always had. And in that trust, there was rest. Nothing loud, nothing written down. Just breathe. Just quiet. Just life. Kept warm by the simple fact that it was shared. And that, in this world, was more than enough. It was the kind of morning that waited. Not quiet because it had to be, but quiet because it could. The sky was pale with early light, and the village was caught in that small window before everything stirred. Just breath and wood smoke, and the occasional creak of a shutter letting the wind pass through. A soft, watchful hush. Like the village was listening for something, not in fear, but in respect. The fires from the night before had faded to soft embers, glowing gently in their stone pits. Thin trails of smoke drifted upward and vanished into the blue-tinged sky. A builder stepped carefully across the square, arms full of new planks, each one shaped and sanded the day before. His boots left faint prints in the dew-damp dirt. Behind him, the sound of a chisel rang out softly. Not aggressive, just steady, as another builder worked to fit a replacement beam into a storage shed. The smell of cut wood lingered in the air, mixing with ash and cold morning air. Elsewhere, a warrior moved through forms, with a wooden training sword. Not fast, not hard, just with rhythm. One step, one swing, another breath, a pause, then again. She wasn't training for battle. She was remembering how to move, how to stay ready without needing to be on edge. Each motion was part memory, part meditation. The way she kept her body aligned with the quiet discipline that defined the village. A girl passed by with a bucket sloshing at her side. She didn't rush. The well would still be there. She nodded to the warrior, who nodded back. That was enough. Their exchange didn't need words. It was part of the pattern of things. Everyone doing their part, side by side, without fanfare. At the edge of the village, 2 elders worked silently near the gardens, loosening the soil with small tools. Their hands moved with the kind of ease that comes from repetition. Their knees cracked slightly when they shifted, but they didn't complain. They hummed quietly, not a song, just a tone that moved between them like a shared breath. A bird landed near them, pecked twice, and hopped away. Then another bird joined. The garden welcomed them both. In one house, a child tried to thread a button through a coat, tongue between their teeth, brow furrowed. A mother watched without stepping in. She had stitched that coat a year ago and adjusted it twice since. She knew they'd figure it out eventually. The fire in their hearth crackled gently, filling the space with soft warmth. Above it, a pot of porridge bubbled, the kind that stuck to ribs and kept hands warm. Further down the path, a weaver adjusted threads on her loom. Each strand pulled tight, each shuttle moved with precision. She didn't glance up when someone walked by. She was inside her work, counting under her breath. The pattern wasn't complex, but it mattered. It was the kind of thing that took years to get right and hours to undo. And above it all, the village stretched slowly awake. A yawn here, a whistle there, boots tied, doors eased open, the kind of waking that had no urgency, because nothing was chasing them, no alarms, no flames, just the gift of a day that didn't demand anything except attention. This wasn't the day of a raid or a rebuild. It wasn't the day of visitors or changes. It wasn't the beginning of anything remarkable, and that was what made it rare. The beauty in repetition, the magic of nothing urgent. This was a day for existing, for sweeping paths, sharpening tools, stirring soup that didn't need to be done until lunch, for brushing a horse's mane, for boiling water just to clean, for quiet thoughts and steady hands, for leaving things better than you found them. Not dramatically, just a little. The kind of day that slipped by almost unseen, but that held everything together underneath it. The kind of day where you looked around, not for excitement, but for signs that things were still holding steady. The kind of day you didn't notice was perfect until it was gone. And in that slow unfurling of moments, the village found its heartbeat again. Quiet, steady, enough. The kind of rhythm that didn't draw attention but kept everything standing. The kind of peace that doesn't ask to be remembered, but never really leaves you once you feel it. By the time the sun sat high in the sky, the stillness of the morning had softened into the quiet movement of early afternoon. The kind of movement that didn't demand attention. It simply carried on, without rush, without pause, just the sound of footsteps on well-worn dirt, the low creak of wooden beams expanding under heat, and the occasional rustle of wind weaving through linen drying on the line. A group of children had gathered near the edge of the storage sheds, their voices hushed as they built something with flat stones and old pieces of broken pottery. Not a game. Not really. Just the act of arranging things until they looked right, until they made sense in a way only they understood. One of them stood and pointed at a cloud, arguing gently about whether it looked more like a horse or a loaf of bread. The others giggled, not because it was funny, but because it was a moment worth sharing, an anchor of calm in a world that always hummed with motion. Their laughter was quiet, but contagious. A nearby goat paused mid-chew to watch them before returning to the bundle of dried grass by the fence. The children's feet left little trails in the dust, circling and crisscrossing like tiny stories written across the ground. An older sister, watching from a distance, smiled and turned back to her task, filling a basket with dried figs, pausing now and then to press one to her nose to check for sweetness. In the shade of an open awning, a pair of older girls worked side by side, weaving dried reeds into baskets. Their hands moved in near silence, except for the soft scrape of stalk against stalk. One worked quickly, efficiently. The other paused more often, adjusting, starting over, not out of frustration, but because she wanted it to last longer. She liked the feel of the work more than the finish, and that was fine. Behind them, a small clay pot steamed gently over a low fire, filled with herbs soaking in water for dye. The marketplace, if it could be called that, was a scattering of tables and rugs with small things laid out. Carved figures, scraps of dyed cloth, bundles of herbs tied in string, hand-stitched dolls, a chipped comb. No coins changed hands, just trades. A cup for a charm, a patch of wool for a bit of oil. Quiet negotiations made with eyes and nods instead of voices. A father and son passed through, exchanging a jar of dried lentils for a new water skin. Each word they spoke slower than necessary, as though drawn out to fit the stillness of the hour. At the well, 2 women filled jugs and talked softly, not about anything urgent, just about a new patch of moss on the north wall, or how the wind had shifted slightly in the last few days. Their words floated like mist, more comfort than information. Behind them, a boy lowered a rope carefully, watching the bucket disappear into shadow before pulling it back up, slow and steady. He held the rope like it was something precious, even though it was rough and frayed. A grandmother sat by her doorway with a spindle in her lap, spinning thread from wool that had been combed that morning. Her fingers moved as if on their own, guided by memory more than sight. She didn't look up often, but when she did, she smiled. Not at anyone, just in general. The kind of smile that came from being exactly where you were supposed to be. At her feet, a bowl of shelled nuts rested half full, waiting for her granddaughter to return and finish the job. Birds flitted between rooftops, chirping soft and aimless. A cat stretched along a warm stone, eyes half-lidded, tail flicking lazily with each passing breeze. A dog barked once and then lay back down, content to patrol with half-closed eyes and twitching ears. A rooster crowed a second time that day, confused by the angle of the light. And in the far distance, the blacksmith's hammer rang out, slow, spaced, more like a heartbeat than a warning. Each strike echoed faintly, folded into the fabric of the afternoon like a punctuation mark. No one was in a hurry. No one needed to be. This part of the day was about trust, in the rhythm, in the people, in the sky holding steady, in the shared understanding that this, right now, was what kept the village alive. Not just food or tools or defense, but this quiet persistence, this peaceful momentum, and that was enough. More than enough. The sun drifted lower in the sky, shadows stretching farther across the ground, folding gently over rooftops, across doorways, and beneath the tall palms at the edge of the settlement. The pace of the village didn't change. It simply deepened, like a breath drawn in and held just a little longer. Near the edge of the fields, a group of women worked in slow rhythm, collecting leftover stalks and sorting through bundles of reeds. The sound of their hands moving through the dry brush was steady, like soft rainfall. One of them sang under her breath, a tune too old for anyone to remember its beginning. The others didn't join in, but the melody settled in among them like a familiar breeze. Further down the path, 2 young boys balanced a long plank between them, carrying it toward the storage shed. They walked carefully, each trying not to tip the weight too far. Behind them, their mother called out a reminder neither really needed. Something about not running, about watching their step. The kind of reminder that was more tradition than warning. Near the water's edge, old nets were being repaired. 3 elders sat in a tight circle, weaving and tying. Their fingers knotted with age, but sure in motion. The nets weren't for fishing anymore. Not in the usual sense. They were symbolic now. A way to show the younger ones how things had been, how they still could be. A young girl sat beside them, mimicking their motions with a strand of twine, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. Back in the heart of the village, the baker's fire was down to embers. The last loaves had been pulled hours earlier, but the warmth still lingered. The scent of baked grain and herbs clung to the air. A father and daughter sat on the step outside, splitting the final piece of bread between them. She asked questions between bites. He answered without rushing. No lesson, just company. The animals had quieted again. A few goats stood in shadow, chewing slowly. Chickens nestled beneath the baskets and tools that leaned against a mud brick wall. A dog trotted through the narrow lane, pausing at each doorway as if checking in. Not begging, just present. In the shade of the wall, a woman carved shapes into wet clay. She wasn't in a hurry. Her hands moved with the kind of patience that made each mark matter. Beside her, the finished tiles lay in the sun, waiting to harden, waiting to become part of something larger. A small boy approached, watched silently, then sat without a word, tracing shapes in the dust with a stick. Even the birds had slowed. Fewer calls now, more gliding, their wings casting quick shadows across the village floor. The cat had moved from its stone perch to the soft dirt under a fig tree, eyes closed, breathing even, completely still except for the occasional flick of its tail. And from the highest point, the lookout where a watchman stood with his back straight, gaze stretching to the horizon, everything below looked like it had always been this way. Not frozen, not staged. Just natural. Just right. The light shifted again, deeper now, golden, heavy, the kind of light that made even the dust look sacred. And still, no one rushed. Because the end of the day wasn't an ending. It was just another part of the rhythm. The village knew this, felt it, lived it. And so, it continued. Quiet, grounded, completely certain of itself. The air had cooled, just slightly, enough to notice on the skin, enough to lift the corners of cloth hanging from doorways. Evening crept in without sound. It didn't demand attention. It simply arrived, 1 degree, 1 shadow, 1 longer breath at a time. The kind of arrival that required no announcement, only acceptance. From rooftops to footpaths, the village shifted in response. A subtle slowing, the brush of sandals dragging lightly through dust, the tug of loose fabric drawn tighter over shoulders. The shift wasn't just in temperature, but in intention. Day had done its work. Now came the hush that followed. A few lanterns had been lit, low to the ground. Their flames flickered behind clay shields, casting soft orange halos against the walls. Not bright enough to interrupt the dimming world, but enough to find your way from one home to the next without stumbling. Some were hung from hooks hammered into wooden beams, others placed carefully in niches dug into mud brick. They weren't decoration, they were memory. Flames passed from hand to hand, night after night. In the open courtyard near the center, several families gathered without plan. A boy tossed a stone back and forth between his palms, the motion slow, almost hypnotic. An older woman threaded beads through a length of string, each color chosen without rush, without explanation. Someone passed around a shallow bowl of dates. Soft, dark, sweet. No one announced their arrival. No one asked questions. It was understood. This was simply what happened when the sky turned that shade of blue, and when work no longer called. A small group of teens practiced with wooden staffs off to the side. They didn't spar. They flowed. Slow movements. Turning. Resetting. Moving again. It wasn't about battle. It was about memory, keeping the movements alive, even if they didn't fully understand what they had once meant. The wood thudded gently against the ground in rhythm, a sound as much a part of the evening as the insects beginning their nightly chorus. A father paced slowly with his baby strapped to his back. The infant had already fallen asleep, but the father kept walking. Maybe for the child, maybe for himself. A routine, a comfort. His shadow stretched across the wall in a long, gentle arc, moving only slightly with each step. Each circuit he walked traced a quiet pattern he never needed to think about. Step, breath, silence. Elsewhere, by a small garden plot, two women knelt side by side, lifting out small weeds with delicate care, their sleeves rolled, their knees dusted in dirt. They weren't talking, just working with a kind of shared silence that meant more than most conversations. Each weed removed with precision, their fingertips brushing soil that had been turned by many hands before theirs. The garden, in its stillness, breathed alongside them. Near the outer edge of the settlement, the guard shift changed quietly. One woman handed her spear to the next, nodded once, and stepped aside. No ceremony, just trust. The new watch settled in beside a tall post, eyes already adjusting to the dark. She didn't need orders. She knew what to do. The wall behind her was cool to the touch, holding the memory of the sun now fading into twilight. A pair of boys lingered by the granary, daring each other to climb the first stones. They wouldn't go far. They knew better. But the thrill was in the challenge, not the climb. One reached halfway, touched the edge, then jumped back down with a laugh and a puff of dust. That dust caught in the lantern light, hanging for a moment like gold before settling again. A cat slinked past them, tail held high, uninterested in their game. It paused to stare at something unseen, then darted under a woven fence with barely a sound. Its path was familiar, unbroken, as if it followed some ancient route only it could see, and in the distance, a single drum beat. Slow, even, a reminder, a marker. Not urgent, just present. Another followed, then silence. A call, perhaps, or just a note to mark time. The kind of sound that reminded people they belonged somewhere, even if nothing needed doing. This was how the evening took hold. Not all at once, but in pieces, small shifts, shared rituals, a pattern held in the bones of the people and the bones of the land. The air carried it. The firelight echoed it. The silence shaped it. Not every story ends with a lesson. Some simply continue, quietly, as they always have, as they always will. And here, in this quiet village wrapped in rhythm and dust and memory, continuation is enough. The heat of the day had softened, and with it, the world around the village leaned into a gentler rhythm. It was the time when the clay walls still held the sun's memory, warm to the touch, but the breeze had begun to speak in softer tones. The village listened without needing to stop and acknowledge it. The body just knew. Inside one of the smaller homes, a grandmother gently combed the tangles from her granddaughter's hair. The girl sat still, feet dangling from a short stool, her eyes half closed as the wooden comb passed through each knot with patience. No words passed between them, only the occasional sound of hair catching and then smoothing out again. It was an old rhythm, older than either of them. Near the granary, a man ran his fingers along the base of the outer wall, inspecting for cracks. The sun wouldn't hit this side again until morning, and it was the perfect hour to find what needed mending. His other hand held a clay pot of fine mud, and wherever his fingers found weakness, he patched it. He wasn't rushed. There was time. A dog slept beside the entrance, its ear twitching now and then, disturbed only by the breeze or a nearby insect. It was the kind of sleep that meant safety. No tension in the limbs, no sudden starts. In a nearby courtyard, several mats had been laid out, woven from reeds and softened by years of use. A pair of women sat across from each other, with baskets of dates and figs, slowly sorting through the fruit. The ripest ones were placed in a wooden bowl between them. The bruised or overripe ones were set aside, not wasted, just saved for something else. Their hands moved with a kind of memory that required no attention. They talked about nothing and everything. The rhythm of their voices matched the rhythm of their sorting. One of the boys from earlier now sat alone near a post, carving lines into a piece of soft wood with a sharpened stone. The pattern had no shape. Not yet, but his eyes narrowed in concentration. He wasn't carving for praise. He was carving because it helped time pass. Further down the path, a builder rested with his back against the base of a wall he had helped raise seasons ago. His hands were coated in fine dust, his shoulders darkened by sun, and his eyes fixed on the slowly darkening sky. He hummed softly to himself a tune without words, possibly without origin, but familiar all the same. A few younger girls chased each other quietly between homes, their steps light, their laughter held back to a whisper. One of them carried a thin branch, like a wand, casting imaginary spells into the gathering dusk. Another wore a crown of dried flowers, slightly tilted, and high above on the roof of the tallest hut, a teen sat cross-legged, watching the last stretch of orange fade from the clouds. She didn't move, didn't speak, just watched, as if her gaze alone might slow the coming dark. Below her, the whole village moved through its own quiet rituals. Small, repeated acts of living, all simple, all necessary. Evening was never a single moment. It arrived like a tide. And as it washed over the village, everyone adjusted, slightly, gently, instinctively, like they always had, like they always would. Shadows stretched longer now, clinging to the ground like quiet echoes of the day that had passed. The last of the golden light dipped low, brushing rooftops, slipping between woven walls, catching in strands of hair and corners of cloth. It was a light that didn't ask for attention. It simply gave its last warmth and moved on. In one corner of the village, a woman stirred a pot hung low over hot coals. The stew inside was thick with lentils and wild greens, the kind of meal made not from planning, but from knowing what was still good, what had to be used. She stirred slowly, tasting from time to time, adjusting with a pinch of salt, a splash of water, a squeeze of something sour. Behind her, a child crushed herbs with the flat side of a stone, rhythmic thuds spaced like a heartbeat. Two elders leaned against a wall nearby, sitting on overturned baskets, their legs stretched in front of them. One traced a scar on his arm, not out of pain, but memory. The other chewed thoughtfully on a bit of sugarcane, eyes half-lidded, speaking only when there was something worth saying, which wasn't often. They watched the village more than they watched each other, nodding now and then at familiar shapes passing by. At the edge of the village, two sisters swept the pathway with dried palm brooms, working slowly, side by side. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Dust rose and fell again in soft clouds. It was work meant for this hour, unhurried, light, the kind of task that signaled the day was ending. A father sat with his daughter near a faded wall, braiding strips of fabric into a rope. She handed him each piece with care, her fingers still learning the pattern. He worked steadily, explaining nothing, letting her watch, learn, repeat. The rope would hold something important tomorrow. A bucket, a gate, maybe a cradle. It didn't matter. Tonight, it held their time. Up near the granary roof, a lone bird settled in, wings rustling against thatch. Its cry was brief, then gone. The silence it left behind was softer than before, more complete. The light now was less gold and more blue. Cool, honest, the kind of light that didn't flatter, but didn't lie either. You could see clearly in this hour, not just with your eyes, but with your memory, with your sense of what had been done, and what could wait until tomorrow. No one called it evening. No one announced it. But everyone knew. The day had shifted, and the village, as always, shifted with it. Somewhere in the quiet, a loom creaked. It was the kind of sound only noticed when everything else had gone still. The soft pull of thread, the measured click of wood, the breath held just before a line was tied. In a shaded corner of the village, beneath a half roof woven from reeds, a girl sat cross-legged, working the loom with fingers that had learned from watching more than from being taught. The cloth she wove wasn't elaborate. No dyes, no patterns, just straight lines, tight, even, practical. It would become a wrap for a baby, or a sack for grain, or bandages if the season turned cruel. Her hands moved steadily. The world outside her weaving slowed to match her rhythm. A neighbor passed by with a basket of date pulp balanced on her shoulder. She didn't speak, but nodded once. A greeting, an acknowledgement, a reminder that in this village, seeing someone work was enough. In another yard, a boy washed a clay jar with handfuls of sand. The grains scratched away the soot from its surface, the water running cloudy into the dust. He tilted it to catch the fading sky in the curve of the rim. For a moment, it shimmered. Above, smoke from cooking fires drifted upward in long, lazy threads. It didn't rise fast, just floated, unbothered, knowing no one would rush it. Birds passed overhead. A few voices called good night. Not loudly, not urgently, just enough. Inside one hut, a woman twisted dried reeds into a mat. Her daughter watched, then copied the motion beside her. Smaller, slower. The older woman didn't correct her. She didn't need to. The work itself would guide her. And outside, near the far wall of the village, someone had begun humming. A low tune, no words. It moved through the air like smoke, not clinging, not pressing, just passing through. Night hadn't fully arrived, but the day had clearly stepped back, and in its place came the pause. Not rest yet, just the winding down, the breath before the stillness. The sound of a village, softening its voice. A few stars had already appeared, barely visible against the blue that hadn't turned black yet. The village shifted again, slower than before, as if the air itself had thickened just enough to press gently on every movement. Evening was here, but not loudly. It eased in like a familiar presence, one that didn't knock, but knew its place. In a narrow alley between two huts, a boy knelt beside a line of clay pots, carefully pouring water from one to another. He was checking for cracks, not because anyone had told him to, but because he remembered what happened when one failed. Last season, grain was lost that way. He hadn't forgotten. The woman at the loom had stopped. Her fingers rested in her lap, and the threads hung loose. Not because the work was finished, but because the light was. She sat still for a while, letting her eyes adjust, letting her thoughts wander. The cloth would wait. Everything could wait now. At the edge of the homes, just past where the huts gave way to bare earth and thinned grass, a small fire crackled. Around it, two elders sat facing one another, legs stretched out, heads bowed slightly. They weren't speaking, not with words. Every few moments one would gesture, the other would nod. A story passed without needing sound. A few children lingered near the central path, tracing shapes into the dust with thin sticks. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need direction. There was something sacred about this time. The not quite night, the quiet just before it. Even they understood it. One of the guards on the outer wall adjusted her stance. Her shift had begun. She checked the straps across her shoulder, tapped the edge of her spear against the stone beside her, and scanned the horizon. Nothing moved. That was good. Somewhere, someone laughed. Just once. A warm, worn-out kind of sound. Not loud enough to echo, just real enough to notice. Inside a hut, oil was poured into a small clay lamp. A spark, a flicker, then a steady flame. Its light danced against the walls, casting long shapes across woven mats and stacked baskets. Everything was slowing. Even the wind had calmed. Even the smoke now curled more gently. This wasn't sleep yet, but it was close. A village caught in the softest part of the day. When nothing pressed and nothing pulled. Just the ease of being together, without needing to speak it aloud. The last of the light held on, stretched thin across the tops of huts and the low wall that wrapped the village like a quiet arm. It wasn't dark yet, but it was getting close. That in-between moment when the world softened just enough to stop measuring time. Near the well, someone drew water, not quickly. The bucket rose with a lazy rhythm, rope creaking softly against stone. No one waited in line. The need was less now. Most had already filled what they needed for the night. In one corner, where the homes curved inward and made a small hollow in the layout, an old dog lay stretched out in the dirt, paws twitching in its sleep. A child passed by and slowed, watching the dog's breath rise and fall. She didn't speak. She didn't touch it. Just watched, then moved on. On the roof of one hut, a boy sat with a thin blanket over his shoulders, feet tucked beneath him. He looked out, not at anything in particular, just out, over the treetops, toward the hills, toward the stars that were starting to push through the darkening sky. He didn't look tired, but he didn't look awake either. Just still. The fires were small now, low to the ground, enough for light, not heat. People gathered near them, not to eat or speak. Just to be there. Someone handed off a small bundle of sticks to feed the flame. Someone else leaned back on their hands and watched sparks spiral upward and vanish. From one of the homes came a soft sound. Not music, not quite. Just a string of notes hummed gently, without melody, without urgency. The kind of sound a person makes when they aren't trying to be heard, only to remember. Across the village, the guard shift changed again. No one announced it. One person climbed down. Another took their place. The spear was passed without a word. Eyes met. That was enough. In the distance, a bird called once, then went silent. The kind of silence that feels full rather than empty. And then, the lamps began to dim. One by one, flames were pinched out or left to flicker and fade. Doors closed. Feet settled. Breaths deepened. There were no good nights, no final signals. Just the soft unraveling of a day that had done its part. Sleep hadn't come yet, but everything was ready for it.